Greetings everyone, Ryan Sprague here, host of Somewhere in the Skies. For over 7 years and more than 400 episodes, the Somewhere in the Skies podcast has always been free to listen to, but it's not free to create. So we offer several ways to help support our efforts and get rewards in return. If you listen to the podcast on Apple, you can click the subscribe button at the top of your Somewhere in the Skies feed to become a premium Apple subscriber. Or you can join our Patreon campaign with several tiers available. Both of these options give you the same benefits and rewards: ad-free episodes, early access to the main show, and bonus episodes and content. Help keep the lights on at the Somewhere in the Skies HQ, and help us continue to grow by becoming a Patreon subscriber at patreon.com/somewhereskies, or by clicking the subscribe button at the top of your Apple feed. Thank you for your continued support, and keep looking up. Perhaps what makes UFO sightings with multiple witnesses intriguing is that it makes it harder to dismiss. And there are many cases out there that are very visible and have been talked about for decades. But there are much lesser known cases that are just as intriguing, and of course, just as mysterious. Today, we'll look at a collection of the lesser known cases and continue to ask the ever-elusive question: what is truly going on somewhere in our skies?
This is Somewhere in the Skies with Ryan Sprague.
At around 6:40 p.m. on September 8, 1958, at Offutt Air Force Base in Omaha, Nebraska, Major Paul Deutsch was just about to eat dinner at the Officers Club at the Strategic Air Command headquarters. After ordering his food, he excused himself from the table to purchase a newspaper from the lobby across the road. As he crossed the street, however, something in the sky caught his attention. As he looked upward, he noticed a short vapor trail in an otherwise clear blue sky. For reasons he couldn't explain to himself, there was something peculiar about it. So much so that he turned his attention to it once more. That's when he saw the vapor trail suddenly glowing brightly and becoming a brilliant source of light. He described it as looking similar to a magnesium flare. At this point, he stopped walking and kept watching this. After watching for about 2 minutes, fully expecting it to dissipate as any other vapor trail would, he finally called out to another officer and pointed upward. He and several others also now turned their attention to the sky, perplexed as to what this motionless glow might be. The more they watched and discussed with each other, it was determined that it was likely something solid, as it was reflecting the last of the day's sunlight. At this point, Deutsch contacted the control tower and asked them to look to the west. The officer in the control tower did so, responding that he could see what appeared to be a short vapor trail that was very odd. As this was taking place, the object began to grow dimmer, as well as taking on a red-orange color. Even more amazing, as it did so, it began to appear much like a solid object in the shape of a cigar. By now, around 20 people had ventured outside to see what the commotion was all about. All of them witnessed what appeared to be a swarm of black specks emerge from the object and move around independently, appearing like a swarm of gnats. These smaller black objects continued this for several minutes before just disappearing. So what were these black specks? Were they some sort of scout ship or possibly even an early version of a drone? As the small crowd of officers looked on in amazement, the object then moved into an upright position It started to creep towards the west at a relatively slow speed. As it moved, while it remained an orange-red color, the tone of the exterior changed. The group continued to watch for several minutes as the object continued in the same direction and eventually faded into the distance. One last detail of interest in the encounter is that Deutsch offered that during the incident, a colonel at the base had set up a tripod and camera and had seemingly managed to capture several color photographs of the object. Although Deutsch asked him on several occasions about those photos, the colonel simply admitted that none of them came out clear. And ultimately, the incident remained unexplained. According to a NICAP case report, on the morning of October 2nd, 1961, over Utah Central Airport in Salt Lake City, Utah, private pilot Waldo Harris was preparing to take off in his Mooney Mark 20A when he noticed something bright in the sky over Salt Lake Valley. Assuming it was simply another aircraft, he proceeded with his takeoff. However, by the time he was in the air, he noticed that the object was in the exact same place as it was when he'd first seen it. Although he was now curious, he still believed that the object was simply the sun reflecting off of another airplane. He continued to pay attention to the object, and once he was satisfied that it was simply hovering motionless, he turned his plane in its direction. And the closer he got, the more he could see that the object was not a plane. The first thing he noticed was that the object had no wings, and no tail, or any other exterior control surfaces. It appeared disc-shaped and seemed to have a rocking motion about it as it hovered. He estimated it was around 50 feet across and around 10 feet tall. He further added that he couldn't make out any windows or doors anywhere on the object, or any kind of landing gear. At this point, he estimated he was around 2 miles away from the object. As he got closer, it rose to around 1,000 feet above him. Then, the next thing he realized, it was in motion, eventually coming to another hovering stop around 10 miles from his aircraft. Once more, he turned his aircraft in its direction and began to close in on the object. However, as he did so, the object shot off in the distance and was completely out of sight within seconds. As the incident was playing out, not only was the control tower monitoring the events and in communication with Harris, but around 10 people could actually see the object and his approaching airplane from the ground. In fact, it was because of this communication that Harris witnessed the object again following its disappearance. As he was preparing to return to the airport, the control tower informed him that they had had the object on their screens again. To begin with, he couldn't locate the object in the sky. Then, at a much greater distance than before, he could finally see it, but just for a couple of seconds before it vanished for good. Those who were watching the events from the ground would later inform Harris that the object simply shot straight up into the sky and disappeared. Just under 2 years later, a similar object was witnessed by several police officers in Sunnyvale, California. In the early morning hours of September 26, 1963, at around 4:20 a.m., Officer Galen Anderson was driving his patrol car when the radio suddenly burst to life. Other patrolling officers claimed to have seen a bizarre object overhead. Anderson brought his vehicle to a stop and looked skyward. When he did so, he could immediately see a large, bright object that appeared larger than a full moon, moving from east to west. The longer he looked at the object, the more he could tell that it was a solid, disc-shaped vehicle that was gray in color, with the edge brightly illuminated. The object was traveling at a similar pace to a helicopter and was at an altitude of between 4,000 to 6,000 feet. As he watched, the object made a turn in the air toward the northwest in a perfectly straight line and then disappeared from sight. Anderson later stated that the object appeared as large as the full moon appeared to those on Earth. Furthermore, for the majority of the sighting, it appeared as though the object was traveling on its edge with 3/4 in sight and a quarter of it essentially invisible. Interestingly, one of the police officers who had also witnessed the object, Officer Hogg, stated that in this invisible quarter of the object, he could see what appeared to be heat waves. In total, the object was visible for only 45 seconds. Only 5 minutes before Anderson's sighting, a supervisor at the Permanente Cement Company, George Scott, was alerted to a strange object by his work crew. When he looked up, he immediately noticed an object that appeared to pulse as it moved across overhead. He and the workers all watched as the object headed toward the west and disappeared into the distance toward the coastal mountains. It was later determined that what Anderson saw and that of George Scott were most likely the same object. On the evening of February 4th, 1968, also in California, this time in Redlands, around 200 local residents reported seeing a huge disc-shaped object moving over the city. The incident unfolded around 7:20 p.m., when residents began noticing something strange in the early evening sky. According to a timeline arrived at by investigators, the object appeared above a residential street, moving at a steady pace at an altitude of around 300 feet. After several minutes, the object came to a sudden stop. It hovered overhead before jerking forward, then just hovered in place. Moments later, it simply shot straight upward and disappeared into the night in a matter of seconds. It was later determined from witness statements that the object was around 50 feet across and appeared to have lights of some kind around the base, which expelled several jets of bright orange light. There were also around 10 lights on the top of the object that were red and green. The way the lights were alternating gave the impression that it was rotating. Investigators would contact nearby Norton Air Force Base to determine if they had picked the object up on radar. However, they responded that they hadn't, but also admitted that the radar on the base was one that would not have picked it up anyway. They did confirm, however, that no known aircraft was in the area at the time, and certainly not scheduled to fly that low. No explanation was offered for the bizarre events that evening, and the incident in Redlands, California remains a complete mystery. According to a report submitted to the National UFO Reporting Center, on the evening of May 12, 1968, another disc-shaped object was reported by multiple people in Omaha, Nebraska. The person who submitted the report had arrived in Omaha from Indianapolis as part of a campaign volunteer for the Democratic presidential primary election. On the night in question, the witness was eating dinner with 2 other election volunteers, and, just by chance, happened to be discussing such things as the paranormal and even UFOs. By the time they finished eating and were leaving the restaurant, it was around 9 p.m. As they walked out onto the street, they noticed a school bus parked outside with several students inside screaming and pointing upward through the windows. The trio turned in the direction that the students were pointing and were shocked to see a curious craft hovering overhead, approximately 100 feet above the ground. The object was round, or disc-shaped, with a particularly flat underside and a dome on top. They estimated that it was around 35 to 50 feet across and was completely silent. They could also see a steady white light coming from the domed section, and around the edge were rectangular white lights that flashed around the rim in a counterclockwise fashion. They could see no windows or portholes anywhere on the object. As the sky was clear, they could all see the object perfectly, and they could all tell that it was most definitely not a hot air balloon or a blimp, not least as it was absolutely motionless. By this time, more and more people had arrived on the street outside the restaurant, all of whom had clearly seen the object. While many stood in awe, others ran, terrified about what they were seeing. After several minutes, the object began to move slowly, and it still remained completely silent as it did so. all of the witnesses watched as the object slowly disappeared into the distance. The main witness made some intriguing points in his report. For example, the witness pointed out that Omaha, at the time, was home to the Strategic Air Command. However, despite this, there appeared to be no aircraft in the skies at the time of the sighting. The witness stated that he found it hard to believe that the object was not detected, and that some kind of aerial response was not ordered. And, once again, this case remains unexplained. On the afternoon of July 28, 1968, at around 3:45 p.m. in Winsted, Connecticut, 14 hikers witnessed a huge saucer-shaped object while walking up Blueberry Hill. On the afternoon in question, the group of hikers stated that the object was silver and metallic, and because of the changes in reflections on the surface, they could tell that the object was rotating. A high-pitched screeching sound had alerted the group to the object's presence before it started hovering. After around 15 to 25 seconds, the high-pitched noise returned before the object ascended directly upward and disappeared within a second or two. One of the witnesses stated that the object was faster than anything he'd ever seen. The president of the Northwest Connecticut chapter of APRO, Paula Holmes, would investigate this case, speaking to many of the witnesses, and although she could find no physical evidence of the UFO's presence, she would determine that they had most certainly seen something out of the ordinary. She also suspected that what they might have seen could have been a robot-controlled disc. Another point of interest was the hill that the hikers were on, which was known to have a composition of metal magnesium. This element is commonly used in space technology, so Holmes contemplated whether this might have been the reason the UFO was in the area in the first place, pointing out that a UFO that had apparently crashed in South America had been found to have also contained metal magnesium. She further considered whether the object, if it was some kind of drone, had come from a mothership that was most likely nearby. At around 11 p.m. on March 22, 1978, several people reported seeing a bizarre aerial object while camping in Patapsco State Park in Maryland. On the night in question, 24-year-old Gary Oikel and his 22-year-old brother David, along with two other witnesses, Barry Smith and Ken Cabot, were near the campfire when Barry and David noticed a strange object moving across the night sky. Although it was only visible for a few moments, they could tell that it was flat-looking. After the object disappeared from sight, the two men walked back to the campfire to inform the other two of what had happened. As they were doing so, all four of them were amazed to see a second object, almost identical to the first, appear from behind a ridge and hover directly over the top of them. What's more, they could hear a strange sound similar to a quiet wind or a quietly rushing waterfall, as they would state. All four of them could see that it was a triangular shape with large windows and 3 white lights at the corners. They estimated the size of the object to be approximately a quarter the size of a football field. The object remained overhead for around 15 to 20 seconds before it moved towards the trees, and when it moved, it did so very slowly. Perhaps most intriguing, 3 of the witnesses claimed that they could see the silhouette of a humanoid-like figure through what appeared to be a window of the craft. But, ultimately, the entire episode remains unexplained. On the evening of March 13, 1982, in Moselle, Germany, several teens were trying to get into a nightclub, and while doing so, they witnessed 3 groups of lights flashing in different colors outside. Each group of lights consisted of 4 sets of lights, each of which was flashing, and each set of lights appeared to be moving independently of one another. The first, after moving slowly, came to a stop overhead, hovering over the top of the group. This was followed by the second, which moved and stopped very much in the same way. The third set of lights, however, moved overhead extremely fast. At this point, at around 9:30 p.m., several friends came to the group telling them that there was a strange bright blue flash that was coming from the sky that appeared to be very much like a spotlight. By the time the group had ventured back outside, a blue, luminous disc with a dome on top was visible just above the treetops of the nearby woods. Then, with the group watching on, the object began to head toward the witnesses, descending to a very low altitude. As it came closer, the group could see that the dome section was divided into multicolored segments. While inside, it appeared as though something was rotating like a beacon. On the edge of the domed section, yellow, green, and red lights glowed and flashed, one after another. The object continued to descend, doing so in a spiraling motion, before coming to a sudden stop. Then, a moment later, it suddenly rose into the air once more and disappeared into the distance, leaving all of the members at the nightclub completely dumbfounded. Our last sighting is that of a strange aerial object that featured hundreds of witnesses, including the crew of a military aircraft, as well as several readings from radar stations. And this event occurred on the evening of October 19th, 1998, over Changzhou in China. The initial report featured in the November 1998 edition of the UFO Roundup newsletter stated that after the object was spotted by authorities, a Jinzhou 6 jet fighter was scrambled from a flight training school to intercept it. To begin with, to those on the ground, the object appeared to be a star. However, it grew steadily larger as it began to descend. By the time it was at a low altitude, it was described as a mushroom-shaped object with a dome on the top and a flat underside. On the edge of the underside was a set of bright, rotating lights. To the pilots in the air, pilot and radar officer, they recalled that the object appeared just like spaceships are depicted in the movies. They would eventually close in around 13,000 feet. However, before they could get any closer, the object shot up into the air with great speed, and although the fighter jet attempted to keep up with it, it was unable to do so, with the pilot suggesting that the object, or the intelligence behind it, was toying with them. After several more attempts at closing in on the object, the pilot requested permission to open fire on it, a request that was quickly denied. Instead, he was asked to continue his attempts to pursue it. However, after several further attempts, with the jet running low on fuel, it broke off the chase at an altitude of just under 40,000 feet and returned to base. 2 more jets were scrambled to try to intercept the object, but by the time they had arrived, the object had completely disappeared from sight. A satisfactory explanation was never reached regarding this sighting, and just like all of the sightings before it, remains a complete mystery. These sightings and encounters are just a small number of UFO incidents involving multiple witnesses, and have been tucked into the darkest corners of UFO history. Maybe by highlighting them, we can find other lesser-known cases like these that will help shed light on not just the sheer volume of cases, but perhaps bring us one step closer to finding answers to these mysteries somewhere in the skies. This episode was co-researched by Marcus Loth. To learn more, visit ufoinsight.com. Please take a moment to rate and review us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get the show. It helps us gain visibility and find new listeners. Thank you in advance. We now have a dedicated Discord server. Come join our 24/7 chat about UFOs. You can find a link to the Discord in the show notes. On social media, you can find us on Twitter @SomewhereSkies and on Instagram @SomewhereSkiesPod. Thank you so much for listening. And remember, keep your feet on the ground, but never stop searching somewhere in the skies.
Somewhere in the Skies podcast is part of the LIONSGATE Sound Network. Please take a moment to rate and review the show on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever possible. Thank you for listening.